Promising news on a COVID vaccine. Hi there, here we go again for Plain English, your recipe for success in all things English. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and you are listening to Lesson 315. That means you can find the full lesson at plainenglish.com/315. Coming up today, a COVID vaccine recently completed its Phase 3 trial, and it was shown to be 95% effective, raising hopes that the end of this pandemic is in sight. Speaking of which, in sight is the expression we'll review in the second half of the lesson, and JR has a song of the week. Pfizer, the global pharmaceutical company, and BioNTech, a relatively young biotech startup, have announced that their COVID vaccine candidate was over 95% effective in advanced trials, raising hopes that an effective vaccine could be approved by the end of 2020. Shortly after the Pfizer news was announced, Moderna, another large pharmaceutical company, announced its vaccine, based on similar technology, was also about 95% effective. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, American President-elect Joe Biden, and other national leaders congratulated Pfizer on its news, but were also quick to warn their populations that this is no reason to relax social distancing and ease up on compliance with new lockdown requirements. Still, the news was undoubtedly good and holds promise that the end of the global pandemic may just be in sight. Each vaccine uses relatively new genetic technology to build an immune system response to the virus. In a traditional vaccine, a mostly harmless, low concentration of a relative of the disease is injected into your system, just enough to trigger your body's defenses, but not enough to make you sick. It's a tough balancing act to get that vaccine cocktail right, and many people do still get mild symptoms from traditional vaccines. A genetic vaccine takes a different approach. These vaccines contain special RNA instructions that trick your body into fighting the virus even when it hasn't had the virus. Here's how it's supposed to work. Each virus has a set of receptor proteins. The virus uses these proteins to access the inside of your cells, where it can reproduce and make you sick. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines contain messenger RNA, or mRNA, that will cause your cells to produce the proteins found on the COVID virus, but only the proteins. Now, by themselves, unattached to the virus, these proteins are harmless, but they tell a patient's body that an invader might be present, so the immune system springs into action. a patient's immune system begins fighting the virus before the patient is infected. Therefore, if the patient does get infected or exposed later, if the virus does enter the patient's body, then his or her immune system is already in fighting mode and is able to fight off the virus. If the virus is defeated before it can get into your cells, then the virus cannot reproduce, the patient doesn't get sick, and the patient doesn't spread the virus to anyone else. That's the theory. To test the theory, Pfizer administered its vaccine to 43,000 people in 6 countries in a large phase 3 trial. That's more subjects than are normally included in trials. Half the participants got the test vaccine, half got a placebo. Pfizer then followed up with both sets of participants to see how they were doing after a few weeks. Of the total population, 94 people got COVID. The test group, the group that got the vaccine, represented just 10% of the COVID illnesses. The control group, the group that got the placebo, represented the vast majority of participants that got sick. From that data, Pfizer was able to conclude that the vaccine was more than 95% effective. They were able to conclude that among the people who got the true vaccine, 95% of probable COVID infections were stopped. Moderna's results were similar with a similarly large sample size. Regulators had been hoping for a vaccine to be 70% effective, and they would have accepted one that was just 50% effective. The 95% result was a pleasant surprise. A vaccine doesn't have to work on everyone, and it doesn't even have to be given to everyone in order to be successful for society. If enough people get it and respond, the virus's transmission can be slowed or even stopped. A vaccine with higher effectiveness means that fewer people can be vaccinated to slow the virus's spread. Both companies expect to apply for regulatory approval in December. Governments around the world have already placed orders for this vaccine. Time is of the essence. Pfizer is already manufacturing its vaccine despite not having received approval yet. The European Union has ordered 200 million doses. The US, 100 million, and the UK, 40 million. As big as these orders are, they will only cover 170 million of the world's 7 billion people, as each person needs 2 doses 21 days apart. But the companies are optimistic that they can ramp up production in 2021. Pfizer says it can produce 1.3 billion doses in 2021. And other companies are also pursuing vaccines Some of those are using the same basic technology and approach as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. These vaccines will not be easy to distribute. They must be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius, so they need to be stored and transported at very cold temperatures. Germany, for example, is already planning special vaccination centers that will be equipped with super cold vaccine freezers. That's a challenge in any country, but it will be especially difficult in developing countries where the infrastructure is not as advanced. BioNTech is investigating whether the vaccine might still be effective if it's stored for a few days closer to 0 Celsius. Hey, a quick reminder that our lessons include exercises and quizzes to help you reinforce what you're learning. One of those exercises is a listening exercise. Now, you are listening now, and I bet you understand the main ideas. Some of you will understand 90% of the words, some even 95% of the words. But are you understanding 100%? And that's what the listening exercises will tell you. You'll listen to an excerpt of the program, and your job is to write every word you hear. When you press submit, it will tell you if you heard correctly. That's great to make sure you're picking up on all those little connecting words that we sometimes skip over when we listen. Hey, I know I'm guilty of that in Spanish, but this can help keep you honest and make sure you're truly hearing every word. And it's included in Plain English Plus. These exercises go all the way back to lesson 179, so there's plenty to keep you busy. To join Plain English Plus, just visit plainenglish.com/plus, Plus. The end is in sight. Have you ever heard that expression? In sight is the expression we'll talk about today. Literally, it means that something is visible to you. You can see it. But often we use it more metaphorically. The news about the COVID vaccine was great. In today's lesson, I said it means the end of the pandemic is in sight. Is the pandemic over? No, far from it. But we can now imagine the end of the pandemic. We can now say that it's in the future, and we can predict how it will end. It might take a while. It might take until the end of next year or even longer, but we can now imagine how it will end. The vaccine appears to work, and we can imagine that people will gradually get vaccinated over the next year or two. Every year in March, we in Chicago allow ourselves to think about what it would be like to enjoy being outside again. After a long winter, the end is in sight in March. In January, it feels like winter will never end. In March, it's not over, but there are enough warmer days in March to imagine the end of the cold weather. The end is in sight in March. We use this with any type of painful and long ordeal, usually when it seemed, in the past, like it would never end. I know a lot of you are doctors. To be a doctor, you need to go through many long years of school and training before you can be certified to practice medicine. I don't know, but I bet that during some of those early years, it seemed like your training would never end. But in the last year or two, as you were getting closer to finishing your training, you could really start to imagine the end. You allow yourself to think that the end is coming. Hey, if you're in year 2 of a 6-year process, the end is not in sight. But when you're in year 5, the end is in sight. You can let yourself imagine the end. Now, it doesn't have to be the end. It can be any objective, any goal. I should note that when something is in sight, there are no guarantees. It just means you can picture it in your mind and that it seems realistic. It seems like it's coming. After the American election, Joe Biden was leading in enough states to imagine that he would win. Victory was in sight. It wasn't official yet, and it was still possible for several days that Trump would win, but victory was in sight. He had the lead in enough states to win the election overall. If two sides are in a tough negotiation, it can seem like they will never come to an agreement. But often, one side will move and there will be some progress in the negotiation. If there's enough progress, you might be able to imagine a compromise. A compromise might be in sight. An agreement might be in sight. You might still have some points of disagreement, but if you've already reached an agreement on the biggest points, then you can allow yourself to look forward to reaching an agreement overall. An agreement is in sight. When will they play basketball or hockey again? You might remember the NBA and NHL seasons were interrupted by the pandemic, and they finished last season right around the same time that this season was supposed to begin. The schedule was all messed up. Well, now both leagues have a plan. Basketball believes it will start on December 22nd. Hockey will start around the 1st of the new year. But there have been many issues to contend with. Would fans be allowed in the arenas? Would teams travel the way they typically have done? What about the teams that play in Canada and cannot easily cross the border? All these issues have not yet been resolved, but a resolution is in sight. They are making progress on resolving these issues. Not every issue has been solved, but they have made enough progress to imagine a full resolution shortly. A resolution is in sight. Today's song of the week is Bring Me to Life by Evanescence. The lyrics describe a person who's numb to life and in a funk. She asks another person to wake me up inside and save me from the dark. It's not a bedtime song. It has a lot of energy. Maybe it's a song to pump you up for a workout or something. So thanks, JR, for selecting that song this week, Bring Me to Life by Evanescence. And the end is in sight. We are coming to the end of today's lesson, but don't worry, there's always a new lesson coming your way in just a few days. That's because we produce brand new lessons every Monday and Thursday. And listen, if you're not ready for the fun to end, you can always log on to plainenglish.com/315 and continue studying this topic. That's where we have the transcripts, translations, video lesson, and exercises all associated with this great topic. So check that out at plainenglish.com/315.